Welcome everyone to the Racial Inequities of Payday Lending. We are really excited to have you today. We are recording this event to share with others who cannot be here. And you probably recognize many of the other faith leaders on this call today. There are a few people joining us who either work at MCC with me or Payday Lending in Minnesota, so we welcome them as well to this call. And a reminder to mute yourself if you are not speaking, so we don't hear background noise. We do have a presentation to show you today, and we'll pause to answer questions that you may have. If you do not feel comfortable asking your question in front of the group, you can just click on the chat box and then switch everyone to private message me, and then I can ask your question to the group and leave out your name. But before we get started, I just want to introduce everyone to who is presenting today. This has been a great collaboration with some brilliant minds, so it's been a lot of fun. So Sara, can you start us off and introduce yourself?
Sorry. I'm Sara Nelson-Pallmeyer, and I am the Executive Director of Exodus Lending, which you'll hear more about in a little bit.
Bukata.
Bukata Hayes, Executive Director of the Greater Mankato Diversity Council here in Mankato, Minnesota.
Pastor Maurice.
I'm sorry, I heard great collaboration and brilliant mind. I'm in the wrong meeting. I'm so sorry. Please excuse. Pastor Maurice Staley, the House of Worship, President NAACP Mankato chapter.
All right, Pastor Collette.
You're far too humble, Maurice. I'm Collette Broady Grund, and I am Associate Pastor at Bethlehem Lutheran here in Mankato, and also one of the directors of Connections Ministry, Ecumenical Homeless Shelter here in Mankato.
Thank you. And my name is Nancy Altman. I am the Community Engagement Specialist at Minnesota Council of Churches in Mankato. When our office started in Mankato in 2012, our focus was refugee resettlement. But our Minneapolis MCC office has always had a social and economic component to their work as well. And so when we learned about the large amount of payday lending that was occurring in our area, we decided that now was the time to pick up this work and to advocate for change. And so while we continue to do refugee resettlement as a focus, we have now added advocacy of payday lending to our role here in town as well. So as we begin, I just want to pass it to Pastor Maurice and Pastor Collette to ground us in the work that we are doing here.
I will start. So you all know, most of you, that both the Hebrew scriptures and Christian scriptures lift up care for the poor and the vulnerable as something that is high value to God, and that we are, of course, asked to place the value on the same thing. So I wanted to read to you two scriptures specifically about lending, because I know when I started looking at this, I couldn't off the top of my head think of any scriptures about lending. But as I started to read, then I was reminded of a couple. So this is from Exodus chapter 22. This is reading from the law given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Just a couple of verses. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them. If you take your neighbor's cloak in pawn, you shall return it before the sun goes down, for it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover. In what else shall that person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate. And then in Luke chapter 6, Jesus takes that law even further. as he always does with the law, and says this: if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend from those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But I tell you, love your enemies, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High God. So the scriptural basis for lending fairly is abundantly clear. But I think as churches, we are often worried about getting in over our heads when it comes to social justice. Sometimes we look at the whole big system, especially when it's an economic system, and think, where do we even start? And I know so many of us as clergy have had that feeling lately about the struggle for racial justice as well. Where do we start? And I don't want to discount that feeling, because that confusion is real and the struggle is huge and long. But I want to remind you that Jesus says again and again that the kingdom of heaven starts small. A grain of wheat, a little salt, a little yeast, a tiny little mustard seed. And by the power of those tiny living things, a new way takes root, growing into a great sheltering tree, 100-fold harvest, a whole batch of leavened bread. It doesn't take much to start, Jesus says. And pretty soon you have enough to move mountains. So I am hopeful that this conversation may be one of those seeds. Maybe that yeast or the salt or the wheat, which takes root in your hearts as faith leaders and spreads to your congregations, and ultimately grows up to create a more just economic reality here in Mankato and around our state. And I hope maybe this seed will also be the first of many stands that we as clergy can take to bring about more racial justice in Mankato and around our country. I'll turn it over to Maurice.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Collette. It's a privilege to be with everyone, and I share in that sentiment, Pastor Collette, in regards to the enormity of the specific issues, namely racial inequality, that we as clergy are having to deal with. Nevertheless, I'm so happy to see so many faces on this call that also share in the sentiment of responsibility that we bear as ministers, as pastors, for the people that we are to be leading. I was just at brunch with a member this morning that's grappling with their understanding and or acceptance of the particular issue of racial inequality, not necessarily being able to identify and accept the biases and prejudices that we all have that may prevent he or she from being a better Christian, that may prevent he or she from applying the principles of the Bible to the ills of our world today. And so as we all continue to grapple with that and pray through that for our parishioners, the people that God has entrusted us, they're very souls for us to lead. It's my hope that we all stay strengthened, that we all stay joyful, and that we all continue to pray for one another. Thank you for those scriptures, Pastor Paulette. I have one that comes out of Psalm, the 140th Psalm, verse 12. And we all know that God is a God of justice and righteousness. Those are, as Tony Evans said, those are the twin towers of God's kind of foundation. And so I think that's where we all can start when we begin to delve into human rights and civil rights, as much as we see as we may need to as ministers of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Psalm 140 verse 12 simply says, I know that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted and justice for the poor. I know that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted and the justice of the poor. And so, as we'll all see, and we probably all know now, you know, this particular subject is causing affliction. And so if you couple that with what Pastor Collette just said, then we bear responsibility as the body of Christ to shine the light on those dark corners of our society and really step into the marketplace and begin to namely put biblical principles on the ills of our society. So grateful to be here, grateful to hear all of the insights and input as we move forward.
Thank you. Okay, so we are going to go into our objectives for today. And then we'll start off with Sara. So give me just a moment here to share this with you. All right, can you all see that? It's loading. Can you see it? Okay, all right. Okay, so we hope by the end of our time that you will gain some insight into payday loans, Exodus lending, and specifically the 36% rate cap we'll talk about. We hope that you feel you have gained insight into how payday lenders are profiteers of the history of racial discrimination. And we hope to give you some tools to move forward from those racial inequity conversations to action in our faith communities. So we're going to have Sara talk about Exodus lending and payday lending for us.
Hi again, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you all this afternoon. Again, I'm the Executive Director of Exodus Lending, and we work with payday loans and with people who are stuck with payday loans. I saw that some of you have responded to the few questions that Nancy sent out before our time together, saying, how much do you know about payday loans? And some of you know quite a bit and some of you don't. So I'll give you a quick down and dirty explanation of payday loans so that you have those and we're all at the same level. But I want to start quickly with a couple of quotes from people who have come to us for service who have had payday loans. And the first two I'll read to you quickly are from Blue Earth County residents who have contacted us. And the first one says, I have a Payday America loan through Pan America. The loan I have is $308.80. I have a hard time paying this and borrowing this amount. Another person from Blue Earth County said, I have two payday loans that I struggle to pay twice a month when I get paid. One is $700 and one is $500. And another person says, I have gotten in too deep with payday loans. I need to get rid of them and I will never ever do this again. I had no idea how this would bury me in debt with outrageous fees. A fourth person said, I took out a payday loan in desperation. I said no multiple times because I felt I would never be able to pay it off. But the lady on the phone kept at me until I said yes. It was high pressure and I feel that they took advantage of my situation despite my objections. So what happens is what this fifth person I'm quoting says is I have been retaking out my payday loan for several months. I try to pay it off every paycheck, but then I'm short that money to make my regular bill payments. So I end up retaking out the same loan to cover those expenses. I am stuck in a loop. I try to take out smaller loans, but then I'm still short that money and end up overdrafting my bank account and try to get, as I try to pay bills or afford gas. I only owe about $220, but it's becoming more difficult to pay off. I need to get out of this loop to help my financial situation. So those are the sorts of emails we get on a weekly basis at Exodus Lending. And a lot of them, the majority of them are from the people of color in our communities where payday lenders target their work. Nancy, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So payday loans, as you can see here, are small dollar loans. And what you heard from the people who have come to us for help is they're typically $200 to $500. Sometimes they can be a little bit more. They can even be over $1,000, but typically, and if someone goes to Pawn America in Mankato, if they go to the brick and mortar shops there, those loans will be $250 to $500 typically. But interest rates can be extraordinarily high, up to 450% or even higher. And the requirement if one takes out a payday loan is that they are expected to pay back that loan in full on their next payday. And it requires access to the borrower's bank account, and loans are made without fully investigating the borrower's ability to pay. You can go on. Thanks, Nancy. So, you know, it's a trap because as you heard the person saying here, it's every 2 weeks I need to pay this off and I can't afford it. So I need to renew it. And this traps me because all I can pay is the interest and the fees. I apologize about the phone. I'm at the office. If you can hear it ringing, it'll finish soon. So people will take out a loan. And let's say Nancy comes for a loan to a payday to Pawn America, and she goes to the Payday America portion of the store and says, I need $300. They will provide her the $300, and then in 2 weeks she owes that amount plus interest and fees. And typically it's $15 on the 100. So it may be like $345 that she owes. In 2 weeks, if she can't pay the $345, then they say, no, that's okay, Nancy. We can re-roll your loan and just pay us the $45. Oh my goodness, the phones are crazy here. So we'll just pay the $45, and then we'll roll it over. And then in 2 weeks, same thing, can't do it. So she keeps rolling over the money, the fees and the interest, and can't really get to the principal, not making a dent in the principal. You can go to the next slide. So in Minnesota, about 48,000 Minnesotans took out more than 323,000 payday loans, and borrowers averaged 7 loans each in 2018. And lenders are draining millions of dollars from communities, so people are not paying their groceries, or they're not paying for their childcare, they're not paying for their rent, they're not paying for all these things because they're forced to be paying back the payday lender over and over, typically 7 times. Go ahead. You can go to the next slide. I wanted to talk specifically about Mankato and the Payday America. We do have 2019 stats here. So there were 682 individuals who took out loans at the Payday America in Mankato, and the number of loans they took out was 6,566. So you can see each person took out, you know, on an average, almost 10 loans, and that totaled nearly $3 million worth of loans. The average APR is 259% at that payday lender, and you can imagine, and you think about yourself and the loans that you've paid. I can't imagine that your mortgage is 259%, your car payment is 259%, your student loans are 259%, or your credit cards. Any of those loans you have, I am sure, are less than 259%. But this is what people are being charged at the Payday America in Mankato. And you can see that 64% of those borrowers took out 5 or more, and even 16% took out 20 or more loans before they were trapped out or untrapped, and maybe some of them are still trapped. And that's about 1% of your population in Blue Earth County. So Exodus Lending, what do we do? You can go on. In 2011, a payday loan store opened nearby a church in South Minneapolis, and church members took a stand with their fellow community members and founded Exodus Lending, a nonprofit that what we do is we solve the payday loan problem by paying off people's loans. Interestingly, with the uprising following George Floyd's murder, that payday lender shop was one of the businesses that was ruined. And I don't enjoy denying anybody a job, and I have pain in my heart for the people who worked at that payday lender because people need jobs, but for the owner of the lender, I have very little sympathy. They lost their business, but they now are not ripping people off in the community the way they were. So what we do at Exodus Lending is we pay off the loans. So if someone comes to us, for example, from Mankato, who's been to that payday lender or Payday America in the Pawn America shop, and they come to us and they say, I owe $360 on my payday loan. What we will do is we will literally take over the loan. We will pay off the Payday America, and then the participant pays us back over 12 months with no interest or fees. So if they walk in our door owing $360, then what we will do is we'll divide that typically by 12, and they'll pay us back $30 a month, and we haven't added anything to that loan. So it makes it much, much more manageable. And every month people are tackling their principal and getting rid of that, and little by little taking off their loan. If they can't do it in 12 months, then we always say, well, what can you do? Can you only pay us $20 a month? Okay, well, we'll extend the terms. And we don't harass people for payments. We don't bug them. We ensure that they can make their payments, and we encourage them to meet with LSS or another organization that does financial counseling. And maybe there are some that they could work with specifically in Mankato for that, and we incentivize that. So if someone meets with a financial counselor, we will pay them $50 a visit up to 3 visits, which would be $150 at the end of their time paying back their loan. So our loan program participants were people who were trapped. They live in 33 counties, including Blue Earth, as I said. They enroll online or through the mail. They make payments monthly. They have a steady income, but they're not necessarily employed. So we have a lot of people who are on fixed incomes or social security, and they pay us back as well. And they also have their payments recorded to the credit bureaus to help build up their credit that they have. You can go to the next slide. So if you're wondering if you qualify, or if somebody in your congregation qualifies, it's basically the questions here. So one lives in Minnesota, has a payday loan that charges, or another online predatory loan that charges over 36% APR. Owing at least less than $1,000 on at least one loan. So if you come to us with 12 loans from 12 different places, we can't necessarily support you with all those, but we could support you with some that add up to less than $1,000, and have a steady income, would like to make monthly payments, and we have no income restrictions on that. Go ahead. So if people want to know how to enroll, they can call our number there on the screen, 612-615-0067 extension 3, or go to our website, and there's a see if you qualify button, and click on that, and it'll go through a list of questions, the ones I just went through with you, and to see if they qualify. So you can, to support us and to tackle payday lending, you can donate to us, you can spread the word, and I really hope you, faith community leaders, will share the work of our organization with people within your congregation, so that if anybody does need our services, they will know to come to us. But I also want to talk briefly about how to, contacting your legislators about payday lending law. And you can go to the next slide for that. So this is a lot of information, and this will be available afterwards, I'm sure. But I want you to know that in Minnesota, we have attempted to limit interest rates on payday loans at 36%. Now, 36% may seem extraordinarily high. Most of the time when I give a presentation, people will say, 36%, that's ridiculous. Why don't you go lower? Well, it seems like 36% is kind of a magical number. First of all, it's not, but it came from the Military Lending Act, which was in 2008, where it was decided in Congress that active serving military should not have to pay more than 36% interest rate on short-term small dollar loans like these. And basically what happened is they set up a 36% rate, and as soon as that happened, lenders stopped working with those communities and trying to charge them exorbitant rates. So we are trying to do that in Minnesota, saying 36% is a rate that would still allow a lender to make plenty of money, but it would not cause people a huge amount of harm with their budgets. And actually that's happened in South Dakota in 2016. They had a referendum on their vote or on their ballot saying, should we cap interest rates at 36%? And that passed overwhelmingly, bipartisanly. 75% of the people said, yes, we should have an interest rate that's capped. And we should not be allowing people to make hand over fist off our people who are vulnerable in our community. In Colorado in 2018, a similar legislation was passed. So we're not asking for something that's ridiculous or unheard of in the past. So in 2019, House File 2208 contained legislation that would put an interest rate cap on payday loans issued in Minnesota. And it was approved by the House in 2019, but the companion bill in the Senate did not have that provision that would put an interest rate cap on payday loans. So there was no change. And we hope to address this again in 2021, and people within the Minneapolis area synod of the ELCA have hired Megan, who's on this call, to work on that throughout the state with others. And I think, Nancy, you're working on that as well in your community, so which is wonderful. Nationally, there's also an effort to put an interest rate cap on loans that are small dollar loans like this. And it would be incredibly helpful, because what happens sometimes in Minnesota is some loans are restricted, but people will go to Wisconsin to get them, or they're restricted, but they'll go online to get them. And so, and those lenders don't typically pay a lot of attention to Minnesota law. So that's House Rule 5050, which needs co-sponsors, and Senate File 2833. And some of us are actually in conversations with Senator Klobuchar's office and Senator Smith's office to try to get them to be co-sponsors for those bills. And it would be terrific if people from the Mankato area who would contact their senators and representative to push for that legislation. So that's a lot from me, and I'll finish. If you have questions afterwards, I'm glad to talk about our program, but I am looking forward to the conversation continuing with you all about how to address the racial inequities with payday lending in the Mankato Blue Earth area. So thank you.
Thank you. Bukata and Pastor Maurice, you're up.
I'll go first, Bukata, because I don't have very much. In the just the information that was pertaining to with the invite in regards to kind of how we got to this point of it being racially inequitable payday loans, namely. And I think this is important as we move forward and how we chew this up and present it to our congregation. We all have to do some research and some historical research as to how we could say that this particular ideation, this particular entity affects Black people more so than any other people. Because I think our great people that we serve, that we minister to, may not have any understanding or may not understand why they might have a hand in doing away with this, even biblically. You know, even the verses that Pastor Collette started with, Exodus 22 and Luke 6, and what I said, and just how much we, as the body of Christ, just as Jesus was very interested in the poor and the widow, but just historically, you know, redlining, and I'm sure Bukata is going to get into this, I'll speak to it gently, just redlining and banking, all of those things kind of has set up, even to where these payday loan places are placed within our communities here and nationally. That is kind of why and how we as people of Christ, people of God, have a responsibility in this particular topic. Go ahead, Bukata, that's all I got.
So I appreciate that. So I just want to say I appreciate being with you as a person of deep faith, but not of the cloth. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of engage with you. And so what I wanted to do was talk about two things. One is like this history of racist practices that we know that this payday loan is built upon. And then speak specifically about kind of some efforts we've tried to do here in Mankato, one around kind of undoing some of that. So the first is around banking and housing. And so I'll first start with redlining. And so the term redlining comes from a really specific example, and it impacts much, right? So the concept is that if you were within this red line, you didn't receive the loans, the resources at rates that help you, right, towards home ownership. And we know that in our country, most of our wealth is contained within our home, right? So property. And so, and this comes from the series, and this comes from specifically video 3 of this series, Race, the Power of an Illusion. And so it says, like in 1930, the National Appraisal System came up with a way to assess kind of financial risk in communities and provide a grade to that. And so race was as kind of integral to that scale of high or low risk as was the actual property and the value, right? So one of the things that you saw in that scale was a criteria such as the infiltration of Negroes. And depending on the percentage, it impacted, right, what high or low risk you got in terms of financial risk. It also had the presence of foreign born, right? So again, as we would see race by extension playing out with who we see as part of our community, right? And so the higher those numbers, the lower the grade was. So at that time, 239 cities across the country were graded for financial risk. And the grades ranged from green being the highest, and then there was blue and yellow, and then red being the lowest. So they literally took these cities and they plotted out green and blue and yellow and red. And so the term redlining comes from that red line that they drew around communities that said these were the communities of the highest, in essence, the highest financial risk and the lowest value, right? And so if you think about what those communities look like, they were predominantly communities of color, predominantly Black. And so it made it really hard for folks within those red line communities to receive loans. It's a couple of ways that played out. So one, with the GI Bill, right? And how we saw race played out in the administration of the GI Bill, folks coming back from fighting for our country. What we found is that there was not even access to the GI Bill, that Black GIs, GIs of color were not able to access, right, that pot of dollars to help build families for themselves as they came back. And then when they went into neighborhoods, you specifically had racialized covenants that said, basically this parcel of land could only be sold to people of the Caucasian race. So even if you were able to access the GI Bill as a Black GI, you still weren't able to buy a home in particular neighborhoods because of the racialized covenants. And an example of that is 8 Mile Road. So if you know about 8 Mile Road in Detroit, the big wall, right, 6-foot wall that appears there. The reason for the wall was because white homeowners wanted to kind of access this dollars that was going in to build our country, right, in the early 1930s and 40s and 50s. And they were told they needed some sort of barrier between them and their Black neighbors, right? They built a wall, the 6-foot, 8 Mile wall in Detroit. Property values on the white side of the wall went up. Property values on the Black side stagnated, declined. And in particular, between 1934 and 1962, so 1934 to 1962, the Federal Housing Authority and the federal government underwrit $120 billion worth of mortgages. $120 billion worth of mortgages over basically that 30-year period, and less than 2% went to people of color, right? Less than 2%. And so when you think about this history of racialized kind of policies and procedures profiting really off of this notion of race and how it impacts our communities, I would say the reason our neighborhoods are made the way they are, constructed as they are, it's because of race. And honestly, I think when we think to our example of the Church Universal or faith in particular here in our country, is that one of our most racialized days in America is still our day of worship, right? It's still our days of worship. And so I think it's really important that we understand that this payday loan kind of industry is an extension of really this history of race and racism within our country that started with dispossession of native lands, property, right? That all of us now sit on, the unpaid labor of African slaves, and then to all these things, and then to redlining, right? So this profiteering off of folks of color. And so the last thing I'll say is some of the things we're doing here in Mankato that speaks to or tries to undo this history of racism. In particular, there was a project that we're still trying to have come to our communities called Mapping Prejudice, and it deals with housing, right? And it's in Hennepin County did it, the first one, and that was they went through all the covenants to try and uncover these racialized covenants that have impacted how our communities are constructed, and they found a lot. Here in Mankato, we were beginning that process. COVID and some other things have stopped that. But we did find in communities here in Mankato where there was specific language within the covenant that said this parcel of land could only be sold to members of the Caucasian race. So even here in Mankato, we have we've uncovered racialized language within our covenants that have completely influenced what our neighborhoods look like and how our community was allowed to be built. And that is then on top of, we know, this being Dakota land and the conflict between Dakota and settlers. And so I think it's important as we think about this, the payday loan and kind of what's our role, that we understand that this is an extension of a really long history, and that I think it takes us as folks of conscience and folks of faith to step up and to be visible in trying to dismantle systems that we know are predatory and also are truthfully racist in their underpinnings. So just wanted to say those things again. Thank you for the time to engage today, and look forward to the work that we do here locally.
Thank you. Well, we have said a lot so far, and everybody's been pretty quiet. So if you have any questions, please let us know. I'll maybe just kind of pause here for a second. Again, you're welcome to use the chat box as well. And if no questions yet about racial inequities, payday lending, what Exodus Lending does, I think then we will move to Pastor Collette and Pastor Maurice to talk about kind of next steps. How do we move from these conversations to actions in our congregation? So I'll just kind of pause here and see if there's any questions. Okay. Well, not hearing any questions, let's move into what do we do in our congregations with all of this information?
I'll open up, Pastor Collette, because I don't have very much more. And I think what I do is I invite Bukata down to Mapleton to my small congregation to give that speak. that's sobering. That's just, I know you felt what I felt, and people of faith need to hear that from our great nation. How could you not hear that and say, hey, we need to contact our representative. We need to contact, how could you not hear that and say, you know what? I have a part to play in it. Outside, that's gospel. That's Jesus. That's God. That's the poor widow. That's the disenfranchised. That's what we're talking about. And I think moving forward, all of us as preachers and pastors, we need to be able to present those type of societal issues when we're speaking of overarchingly, and dig into it and do that type of presentation, and then come back to the gospel. Because, man, that was just sobering. And so I literally mean, inviting Bukata down to Faith Bible in Little Mapleton and say, hey, this is why we as people of God need to contact our representative and our senators in regards to payday loans. How could we not, or how could they not hear that and say, we need to do something? That was just phenomenal. And I'm convicted. So that's all I got. Thank you. Go ahead, Pastor Collette.
Yeah, that was number one on my list, not Bukata specifically. We're not going to just put you to work here, Bukata, but we might, but I think the education piece is huge because, I knew about payday loans from when I lived in Chicago, but until Megan came and visited me with one of her colleagues last year, I had no idea it was happening in Mankato. And I think that's probably true for most of our congregations. So education is such a huge piece. But I also think, especially as faith leaders, we have access to people's stories in a way that a lot of other people don't. And if we know about this and can ask people who we think might be vulnerable, we will be able to uncover stories that others can't, and help people feel like they don't need to be ashamed of their story, because this is something that happened to them, not a stupid mistake that they made. And those stories are the power that will change this practice. That legislators get all kinds of letters and mail and statistics, and their bills are filled with, all kinds of really technical language. And what breaks through to legislators are the stories that we tell. So when we can contact our legislators, or one of those people who has a payday loan that we know, if we can offer to help them contact the legislators and say, this is what it's like to have a payday loan, and this is what it did to me and to my mental health and my financial health, and it really has to change. I think those are the things that get people's attention. So now that you know, as faith leaders, I hope that you will find ways to ask. I'll tell you, just a couple of weeks ago, we were looking for some stories here in Mankato, because even though there are 682 people in our community that have these loans, I didn't know any of them. And all I did was post on my Facebook page. And I have had now 3 conversations with 3 people who it turns out I do know that have these loans, and have been able to hear what it's like for them, and was able to actually convince one of them to be on the call with Nancy to Senator Klobuchar's staff last week. And I'll tell you just quickly, I was just outside. I have outdoor office hours on Wednesday. And one of the other ones who asked me not to share their information, but told me they would share their story, stopped by to see me in my office hours because they wanted me to see their face and know who they were. And it turned out they had been in worship here last weekend and said that they would be back. And so this for this person, that was also not only a way for her to be able to tell the payday loan story, but also a way back into the church, a place where she hasn't felt comfortable in a long time. So opening up that space for people to tell their stories, I think we can't overstate the power of that, either for motivating ourselves to help make this change or for motivating our legislators.
Thank you, Pastor Collette, for sharing that. What a great story. And yeah, so the woman who had reached out to Pastor Collette, I had called her up and asked her if she wanted to be on a call with Senator Klobuchar's office. So there were a few regional folks from her office, along with somebody from Washington, D.C., and there were a few others of us here in Minnesota, in Moorhead, Duluth, and the Minneapolis, Anoka area, also working on this. And so she joined us for that conversation and was able to tell her story, which was pretty powerful. So, thank you for that connection. Any questions? Everybody's been so quiet. Maybe you're just all taking it in. Maybe I'll get like a rush of emails after this, right? Yeah, Chris.
I do have a question for Sara. As I was listening to your presentation, I've known of organizations like yours in North Carolina, where I came from, who loaned money not only for the repayment of payday lending, but in other ways that enabled people to maybe get a step up from where they currently were. So my big question for you is, I don't want to assume anything, but am I correct that your funding comes from donations? Is that how you're able to enable these folks to pay back these loans to you, that you pay off their loans, and but your money has to come from somewhere?
Right. So thank you for asking that. Yeah, our money for the staff, for our salaries, for the office, and all that does come from donations from individuals. We did get some money from the state, actually, a couple years ago, but that wasn't renewed just because the legislature changed. But for our loan pool, that comes from investments of people who want to do good with their money and don't necessarily think having it sit in the bank is what they want to do with it. So we get investment loans to us, 3-year loans of typically $10,000 that we will use for 3 years, and we don't pay any interest on those, just as we don't charge any interest. So if and I'll pick on Nancy again, just because I know her. So if Nancy would instead of having a payday loan, would have some extra money that she wants to use to support the community, then she could lend us $10,000, and I would sign a promissory note that says, in 3 years, Nancy, I will pay you back your $10,000. But meanwhile, I'm going to be working with people in the community to help them pay off their loans. So we do that with that funding. And then also, as people pay their loans back to us, we use that funding. That's a revolving fund. So we use that to help other people as well. Does that answer your question, Christine?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add a suggestion just for a way to introduce this in a congregation? Is that the congregation that I was a part of, which is the one Sara was referencing earlier, as we had a second payday storefront open up in our neighborhood, and it started a conversation. Our pastor preached a few times on this issue and sort of all the related issues we were talking about, and then surveyed the congregation during worship, an anonymous survey, and asked things like, have you had a payday loan? Have you had your home foreclosed on? Are you somebody who's living paycheck to paycheck? And the results of that survey kind of blew us away. We, like a lot of people, show up on Sunday mornings presenting very, middle class or upper middle class, which wasn't the reality for many of us, and isn't the reality for many of us. And so to be able to get the results and say, 65% of us consider ourselves to be living paycheck to paycheck, let's start talking like that's the case and acting like that's the case. And it's changed the way that we have thought about stewardship and presented sort of stewardship questions to the congregation. It's changed what we feel comfortable charging families to send their kids to camp. Like it just, it kind of cut through some of the nonsense that we, put on when we present ourselves publicly, and opened up some doors for real conversation, and broke down the sort of us versus them. When we're talking about payday lending, it's not like, well, we don't have, financial problems like that, but whoever they are do. It sort of broke down those barriers, and was transformative. So just to throw that out there as maybe, I am sorry, this is my reality right now.
Say that I think once you start talking about money in church, for me anyway, it brings up a whole lot of theological stuff about what we do with our money in the church, and the things that we as churches and members of churches think are really important. And when you look at your budgets and you see where your money is going to maintain your large fancy buildings, and it just takes us right back, I think, to the inequity of the way that we live today. We have a Latinx church that is a different denomination that meets in our building when it's open, which hopefully will happen again someday. They are unencumbered by a building or anything other than the joy that brings them to worship. And, I get up on my soapbox. I wish that, as Collette was talking about, I preach this stuff all the time, but I don't know how exactly to get that point across in a way that people are responsive to it. I love what you said about, where are you? Who was that? Megan, who was talking about what they found out in their church. My church is small. Most of my congregation is elderly. They're on fixed incomes. And the truth is that I don't really know what their financial situations are and how many of them might be struggling in ways that we're not aware, because there's a whole lot of Minnesota pride that goes on here too, that people don't want to share. So this is opening a lot of thoughts for me, and I appreciate being invited to be part of this today. I'm gonna let it kind of sit for a little while and see where it takes me. See if there's something else that I can make folks uncomfortable about.
All right, I'm getting a few messages here with apologies for having to go. So it seems like people are very interested in sticking around, but I know time is calling and you are all busy people. I hope we can stay connected, and I hope that this conversation continues. We definitely don't want it to stop here. We hope that, kind of going back to why we brought, this together, we want people to know what's happening in their community with payday lending, that Exodus lending is definitely an option for anybody that you hear. in Minnesota with those eligibilities. And, you know, when you hear that number, that 36%, that yes, like Sara said, although that seems so high, that don't vote against that. Because the alternative, again, of what is happening here in Blue Earth County is that our APR is 259%. And so that is the reality. That is the other reality of this. We hope that you've gained some ideas or insight of how to kind of have these conversations in your congregations, whether that be about the racial inequities or to talk about money, which is, I know it's a very uncomfortable topic. And so I hope that we will be able to stay together. Tom, do you, I see yours is blinking. Did you have a question or anything or no?
Well, I was just curious what next steps you had in mind, whether Exodus Lending depends on local presence of any kind, or if you're thinking about that, or, you know, what, besides being informed, what we might do.
So while Exodus Lending is located in St. Paul, it is available for anybody in Minnesota, as Sara went over kind of those eligibility things. And so as Pastor Collette noted too, like some folks that while she's opened this conversation up, have, you know, been able to connect them to that resource in that way. And I know that any of us would probably be more than happy to come and speak to your congregations as well to talk more about this, if you're feeling like that would help in any way.
Okay.
I have one other question, just off the top of my head. Has there been that I'm sure there has been, but do you have statistics on the increase in these payday loans since we've been hit with the COVID-19? I'm sure, has there been a huge impact?
It's really hard to say. The statistics from payday lenders are required once a year at the end of March for the previous year. So it'll be a while before we, you know, before we know exactly what the long-term impact was or still will be. I think right now it's there in a way with a little less usage, but with the $600 that people got who are unemployed, who lost their jobs. And I think, you know, now we're bracing for a big uptick. We've had more, but again, we're just one small subset of the people who take out payday loans, you know, or we serve one small subset of the people who take out payday loans in Minnesota in the year.
So I had a question. Is there any statistics into refugee or the Somali community that we serve that do take out payday lending loans, so that if these conversations
Habiba, you kind of went in and out. Could you ask that question one more time? It sounded like you wanted to know if there were like demographics to who was using it in our area.
Right. I mean, mostly like the refugee population or the Muslim population, so that if these are also conversations that we need to be having in mosques.
I don't know what the statistics are in your area. It's a good question. And I find for our work that for the most part, the Muslim population is not the population that's taking out payday loans because they are so reticent to take out loans that involve interest. And because they don't pay interest or want to charge interest, it's I would say the community that has less trouble with payday loans than others. Now, not to say that that Muslims don't have loans. When I've met with them, it's like, well, yeah, we do have these loans. We just don't know how to make it here otherwise in this country. So I know people do, but I think that's more typical with larger loans, such as, house mortgages and car loans and student loans and that sort of thing. I think it probably is a little bit less for payday loans, which is a good thing for the Muslim community. But I won't say that there are none who will take them out. I'm sure there are some, but they're more reticent, as you know.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And Pastor Collette or Pastor Maurice, ways in which the clergy can kind of stay together on this and support each other throughout this process?
It appears as though most of the clergy on this call are already a part of a group that we have formulated that meets every Wednesday. And Pastor Collette, help me if I'm wrong. I think everyone that came, we meet every Wednesday. So I think this will be a great opportunity to follow up on next week.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone for sticking through it, for hearing what we had to say. We hope that it's given you some insight into kind of what's happening here and some kind of food for thought, things to think about, and how to present that in your congregations and to support each other as faith communities. So thank you for spending the last hour with us, and we hope you guys have a good rest of your day. Bye.